executive director of the New York City Coalition Against Hunger. He's also authored the book, All You Can Eat, How Hungry is America.
All the data says to be schooled, you must be fueled. To be well-read, you must be well-fed. And so for most of us adults, we structure our whole day around when we eat. But for schools, meals are often an afterthought. In New York City, sometimes lunch is at 9:30 or 10 in the morning. It's insane. Meals should be the centerpiece of the school day. Blasio in the past has come out for universal school breakfast, and we hope he carries through on that. New York City is dead last out of 26 big cities in the United States in breakfast participation. Dead last. 2/3 of the kids who get school lunch don't get school breakfast. 2007, even before the national economic downturn, there were more than 36.2 million Americans living in households that couldn't afford enough food.
Did you know that the sequester was also affecting non-congressional people's lives? Yeah, Alison Cohen has more.
Flight delays aside, pundits have made it clear that the sequester has been a whole lot of nothing.
The sequester turned out to be a no-quester?
It's way overblown, man. Nothing really bad has happened.
But not everyone has gotten the memo.
There will be no happy ending.
Mr. Frowny Pants, Joe Berg of the New York City Coalition Against Hunger.
The whole reason the sequestration hasn't gotten more media coverage is because it's affecting poor people most.
So nobody's really been affected.
Tens of millions of Americans have already been affected. It's a shame on the nation.
All right, so it's all overblown then.
I find it very curious that the very conservatives that sunk our economic ship now want to take life preservers away from the drowning.
Joel, tell us about what this sequestration, which seems like a theory to a lot of people, is doing to your work.
Already, the sequestration has eliminated our New York City-based Vista AmeriCorps program. Chris, I know you were in the Peace Corps, and AmeriCorps is a domestic Peace Corps that allows low-income and middle-class kids to serve their nation and get a small educational award in exchange. We had 11 people placed in soup kitchens and food pantries in New York City, and that has been eliminated by the sequestration.
If we're serious about America being competitive in the world's economy, the single most effective and immediate step we can take is making sure all our children have the nutrition they need to be strong and productive.
It's possible because low-income Americans are disenfranchised from the political system. They don't have campaign contributions to give. Corporate agribusiness has donated $600 million to federal campaigns over the last decade. And it's possible because one side is evil and the other side is spineless. First of all, the attack against their food isn't about deficit reduction. The very same people who voted for an orgy of corporate welfare in the last standalone farm bill, some of whom are benefiting personally to the tune of millions of dollars going to their families' pockets, all of a sudden when it comes to the $1.40 or $1.50 per meal are outraged that our government would spend money feeding our neighbors. Second, we need to know this is about working families. 80% of the able-bodied adults on the SNAP program were working the year before or the year after getting this help, and most households with a working adult are still on the program because they can't get higher wages. So I challenge the other side, if you're against the spending, then join the president's call to increase the minimum wage. That won't cost a penny of government spending.
Our report that we released today showed that Sandy and the recession basically ripped the bandages off the wound that was the festering poverty and hunger in New York City. It showed the problem and it exacerbated the problem. And our report today shows a year after Sandy, years after the official end of the recession, low-income people are struggling just as badly as they did at the start of the recession. A lot of people understand that universal pre-K may be a good education program and may reduce poverty over time, but it's also a good anti-hunger program because more working parents can go work and be less worried about their kids, and those classes get free meals paid for by the federal government, either one breakfast and one lunch, or both. So we will strongly support his plans to do that, and we do believe the wealthiest should pay their fair share.
And Joel, what do you say? Is the fact that they're shipping this food overseas a sign that they obviously don't need it here at home?
No, my staff proved today that story in the Post was absolutely fabricated.
How so?
We sent a member of my staff to both those stores. We got the managers on record. The New York Post did not quote a single person by actual name. And the truth of the matter is, even the story said they put it in these barrels over months. Unless members of the store staff were actually following people home and hanging out in their kitchen over a few weeks or months. You'd never be able to know how people are using it. It's a ridiculous story. The story said they spend $70 to ship it overseas. Most low-income people on the food stamp program don't have it.
We can't get a farm bill passed in America, a farm bill, because the poor are getting too much. I mean, that's where the Republicans are right now.
They claimed it was about deficit reduction, but they stripped out the nutrition title, and then they passed a standalone farm bill that was an orgy of corporate welfare. This isn't about deficit reduction. This is about rewarding their campaign contributors and punishing poor people. Even Bob Dole just published an op-ed with Tom Daschle saying the Republican Party has to get back to its moderate roots of supporting anti-hunger programs. The reason we're not Somalia or Haiti or North Korea is the program's working. It's counter-cyclical, that's a wonkish term, but that means when the economy's bad, it increases. When the economy's good, it goes down. The reason we don't have mass starvation is this program is helping tens of millions of American families survive. And the facts are that before the 1970s, when we had the modern program, we did have third world style malnutrition, and the facts prove that these programs, when properly implemented, almost entirely ended hunger in America in the 1970s. Well, I must say, if Rush Limbaugh has a problem with this Pope, he'd probably have a real problem with Jesus Christ, Reverend. As you know, he spent his whole life talking about the need to fight hunger and fight inequality. It's in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament, and whether you're a believer of his teachings or you just believe in math, you have to understand the trickle-down theories aren't working, and that's why we're so thrilled the White House has forcefully come out against any additional SNAP cuts. That's so important.
Well, I'm tempted to quote Jesus telling a rich man to give all he has to the poor, but I won't do it tonight. I'm not going to do it. Congressman Jim McDermott
Save it for
and
Christmas.
Joel, save it for my Christmas show. Joel Berg, thank you both for your time tonight. Have a great Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
I'm out of here, that blowhard's Just a clarification, any praise of the White House was the previous White House.
Anyway, well, thank you so much. And Joel has to leave early, so I just figured I'd get all his points out quickly. I'm just kidding. So I just wanted to thank everybody for coming this morning to the Food Policy for Breakfast series. I want to welcome you to Hunter College in East Harlem. My name is Charles Platkin. I'm the director of the New York City Food Policy Center and a nutrition professor here at Hunter College. Today we're honored to have several impressive distinguished panelists. Joel Berg, who I just wanted to honor there, and I went through a lot of video to see that one. I know that he's probably not thrilled that I did that, but you know, you'll deal with it as you've dealt with everything.
I just hope it doesn't hurt their digestion and breakfast.
Alison Cohen, Senior Program Director of Y Hunger. Jenique Jones, Director of Operations at City Harvest. And Suzette Ramsundar, Associate Director of Campus Life at Lehman College. I would like to first thank all of our panelists for coming. It's not always easy to get here, and it's not always easy to take time out of your busy day, and you know, we do appreciate it. Thank you. So what we'd like to do is start with each one of our panelists, and we can start with Joel. Just a little bit about what you're doing and your relationship to the hunger cause. And maybe a mention about the topic here today.
Thank you. Don? Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming so early. You can go back out and enjoy the 70-degree
November. You can go back out and enjoy the 70-degree November day after this, where we can deny climate change is happening. Basically, Hunger Free America, we do a lot of direct service, but I think the most important thing we're doing is building the national political movement to end hunger in America. The main point I want to make is we almost ended hunger in the 1970s because we had more living wage jobs, a more inclusive economy, and a more robust anti-poverty, anti-hunger safety net. Most other Western industrialized nations of the planet have long ago ended hunger. And if you say, Joel, it's unrealistic in this political climate that we can do such a thing, I'd say if I was here 30 years ago and I was a marriage equity advocate and I said 30 years from today, because of a political movement that engaged the people most affected as leaders, convinced people in the middle, and isolated the opposition, not only is marriage equity going to be the law of the land in liberal places like Massachusetts and California, but in all 50 states, including Utah and Alabama, you'd say I'm nuts. But people did not accept being half human, and just as I do not accept this nation having 41 million food insecure Americans, and I hope you don't either. And so we can change the politics of this country. It's been done before, we need to do it again, and that's what's gonna take. Some of you may think we can fix this problem with more community farms. We can't. Some of you may think we can fix this problem with more charity and food pantries and soup kitchens, no matter the amazing job of the City Harvest of the world. We can't. The only way to fix this problem is to create a movement to force this nation to create jobs that pay a living wage and ensure there's an adequate safety net. And I hope you guys help lead the movement to get that done.
Okay, great. Hi. Pretty much, we're on the same page, I believe. I'm Alison Cohen, and I work with Why Hunger. Why Hunger is an organization we've been around about 42 years or so. We, since day one, the organization has been working at the root causes of hunger, which, as we know, and as Joel stated over and over again in the reel, is poverty. I've been with Why Hunger for almost a decade now, and in this field of work for about 25 years, primarily began working with small farmers and in the U.S. and the number of small farmers today that are themselves needing to take advantage of SNAP and their local food banks and food pantries is unconscionable. And then moved into this space. I think that one of the core messages that I want to leave you with today is the idea that, yes, politics is a critical aspect, and it is the thing that will help us to end hunger in this country and around the world. We need different policies. We need policies that really strengthen our social safety net. And at the same time, as Joel alluded to, we need to build a social movement. We don't really have a long history of social movements that are sustained over a long period of time in this country. And that social movement must be led by those that are most impacted by hunger and poverty. And that's the work that Why Hunger is doing with grassroots organizations around the country. And I'll speak more to that in a little bit.
Hi, so I'm Jenique Jones, Director of Program Operations with City Harvest. We are the world's first food rescue organization. We're rescuing food from farms, manufacturers, restaurants, supermarkets, and distributing it to food pantries and soup kitchens. I too agree with everything that has been said already, although my organization is really focused on, we know that there is a need for policy change, but there's also a need for people to eat today. And so that is our main focus. How do we help people get the food, the fresh food, and the healthy food that they need today? Because what we also know is that with poverty, with a lack of food resources, comes situations of people having diet-related diseases and other health issues. And so, for instance, 50% or more of what we do is fresh produce. I think that where we are right now is also in this space of helping folks understand that there is a stigma around hunger. So when we talk about wanting the people who are most impacted to join, we have to also understand that we need to change how people feel about being in need, being hungry. There are people who do not come to food pantries or apply for SNAP because they don't want to be placed into that category. So how do we begin to have that conversation? And I know that for me and for my team, a big part of what we're doing is trying to help people see that there is no shame in saying, I need a little help at this particular time, because hopefully that will then get them to a space where they can begin to advocate for themselves.
Thank you. I'm so glad that Jenique went before me, because I'm from Lehman College, which is a CUNY college, and it's one of 10 colleges that is partnering with the food bank and that started food pantries on campus. But when I started my work at Lehman, I've been in higher ed for 10 years, I never thought that a food pantry was something that I was going to open. And I went to a conference last week, and they said, you have to teach the students, or you have to work with the students you have, not the students you want. I recently read the 2016 Student Experience Survey from CUNY, states that 60% of our students at CUNY earn $30,000 or less as your annual income. We know that. We know that we have 40% of our students who are first-generation college students. We also know that 45% of our students show housing insecurity and food insecurity at CUNY. And so I think that I have been at CUNY for 10 years, and it's only in the last 2 years that this was something that I really realized. And after we started a food pantry, not even thinking, this wasn't the goal of what we're doing. We have a big leadership program, and we started thinking of, we're studying the social change model, and what is something that students are seeing on campus that they needed to do to help their peers. And one of the things that I noticed was that a couple kids were coming into our building and asking for food, and then I threw it out to the class. I was like, is this something you see? And I was just so amazed by the need out there. And so I'll get into that a little bit later, but one of the things that I think for us who work in colleges, universities, is just to become more aware of what may be right in front of us.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. So I guess, I just scrapped the first question, and I'm going to come back to that, because I think that's something that comes up often, is that, and as it terms, food insecurity, food insecure, food secure, hunger, and it really has been bothering me since I've heard those terms. We actually, at the Food Policy Center, and this is not about the Food Policy Center, but we just did a survey in East Harlem and the Upper East Side of about 325 people randomly sampled on the streets. And I don't have all the information because we haven't released it yet, but more than half of the respondents didn't understand the term food insecurity. So I guess, can somebody please just sort of, before we get into some of the more detailed topics, at least take on that?
Sure. I just want to say one quick thing about student hunger. I know we're in this. I think it's great, as a last resort, we have student food pantries, but I actually think that should be the last universal response. First, we should all lobby to get student SNAP. It's ridiculous that there's this double standard that's being a full-time student.
That was the first question, by the way.
Okay. But we ought to change that to universities with meal plans ought to give free meal plans, to folks. 3 universities ought to increase their wages, including living wages for work-study students, and only 4 should we have the humiliating step of students going to food pantries. But anyway, food insecurity is defined by USDA. I won't go into the full wonkish definition, but basically they have this survey through the Census Bureau, and they ask a series of 17 questions about, can you afford enough food? Do you have all the food you need? Sometimes you ration food, do you buy less healthy food? And if you answer enough of them in a negative way, you're described as food insecure, or the reverse of that, very low food security. And then if there was a more severe subset of that, where you said, oh, this is frequent, this is acute, then USDA used to call you hungry. But in the Bush administration, Junior, and for all people think, oh, he's wonderful now in retrospect. No, he sucked still. That they stopped using the term, hunger. And the greatest irony of it is because hunger used to be a subset of food insecurity. It was harder to basically lump them together and use the broader 41 million number representing all food insecure people, use that interchangeably with hunger. Now that they stopped using the word hunger, a lot of people use them interchangeably. So the Bush administration's attempt to make the problem seem smaller has actually backfired and make it seem less. Now, we can have a longer discussion of this. I don't like the term, except that people who may not know what the term means, but they live it every day. It's not being able to afford enough food. And I actually think it's a useful construct to distinguish the United States from places in the developing world where people really are starving to death. And the reason they're not here doesn't diminish the importance of our work, but because we have some minimum wage legislation, we have some safety net here, most of which doesn't exist in much of the developing world. And so the fact that we have food insecurity as opposed to massive starvation here is actually a minor little victory. Now again, we're doing far worse than most other developed countries, but we should note this is not as bad as much of the developing world, or whatever you want to, what other less horrible term to describe going from countries overseas.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with the characterization that it does allow us to speak in larger terms and to really expose the magnitude of the issue in this country. However, I also have a deep concern that it is a kind of obfuscation as well, that we're able to, one of the things that we don't have, yes, we do have a decent social safety net compared to many other countries in the world, but we do not have the right to food in this country. It is not a legal human right. We are one of 2 countries in the world that have not signed on, have not ratified the right to food for our pull it towards me, for our citizens here in the United States. And so what I prefer to refer to is the right to food. Who has the right to food in this country and who doesn't? Nobody has the right to food. You can acquire food, you can obtain food, you can even obtain nutritious food through the social safety net that we have, but we have yet to codify the right to food, and therefore our government is not fulfilling its role as a duty bearer, and we don't have any way to except through policy advocacy. Frankly, we don't have any legal recourse. We don't have any way to hold our government accountable to ensuring that no one in this country is hungry or food insecure.
Thank you. So let's switch back to the question about college students. Since we're at Hunter College, and Hunter College is part of the University of New York system, let's talk about college students and food insecurity and hunger issues. Let's talk about the uniqueness. There are about 20 million college students, I think, in the United States currently, or at any one time. What are some of their unique issues around food and why?
Okay. So, four of the number one things that college students spend money on are tuition, food, housing, and transport, right? But when you think of uniquely CUNY, the 40% of our students, 1 in every 2 students who attend a community college is food insecure. And actually it's 2 in every 3 students, it's almost the same, is food insecure. I think that's unique when you think of also that they are first generation students, 45% are first generation. On our campus, we surveyed our students, we said to them, is this pantry actually helping you stay enrolled in college? Will this help you finish your degree? Over half of the students we surveyed said yes, because of this food pantry, because they feel like they don't have to worry about going to buy food, or they don't have to worry about working to provide for their family. They were able to, just focus on schoolwork. It helps them it takes stress off of them. It takes stress off of worrying about providing for folks. And I think that this is pretty, I should say that our pantry is pretty new in a structured way. But when we started 2 years ago, but when we started doing it more in a structured way, we started looking at students' grades. Are they focusing on school more? And I think that it was able to help them academically.
Was this a study or a survey that you did?
It was a survey that we did in-house.
There was a national survey that was done in 2016, and I think they looked at more than 30 colleges or something around the nation, and I can give you the citing if you want to look into it further. But it was the National Coalition of Students Against Hunger and Homelessness, I believe, and that found that 55% of the folks they interviewed reported that they weren't able that they had to forego something else in order to eat, whether that was a textbook or they had to drop a class, and so that's certainly an issue. But I think that the underlying issue, and maybe this is the thing that is not unique but is ubiquitous, is the cost of education. Mm-hmm. That it has far outpaced inflation over the last 3 decades. And again, I think we keep coming back to, I think we will keep, the more when you go down to the root every time, you're going to find that it's really economic insecurity that is the cause of food insecurity.
I just want to add one more survey, since Alison mentioned that. There is a survey that was done by the Wisconsin Hope Lab, and this was the largest national survey that was done on college students to assess basic needs. And the name of that survey is Hungry to Learn, and that's where that statistic of 1 in every 2 community college students are hungry or show food insecurity.
I could just add to this, and I agree with everything everyone said. One slight caveat: the only people with a constitutional court-enforced right to food in America are prisoners. And what a perverse set of incentives that is, that we don't have a broader constitutional right to this. The treatment of students shows the cluelessness of American society about class, including, liberal, white, upper middle class elites. All the student aid, as you know, is focused on paying for the tuition, and often you're subsidizing the costs of, less so at CUNY than other places, but in my new book, if I may plug it, America We Need to Talk, I talk a bit about the salaries at places like my alma mater, Columbia, or NYU, where not only are people making millions and millions of dollars, and not just the president, lots of provosts, etc. We're supposed to be nonprofit institutions, and not only is the university paying for their first home, it's paying for vacation homes, and low-income people, but middle-class people can't afford to pay. But all the student aid is just how you pay for tuition. As if you don't have to eat or sleep for the year. And there's a concordant issue of student homelessness around the country. So there's this total cluelessness about that, and an incredible double standard. As I mentioned in the SNAP program, the relatively new name for the food stamp program, I call that because no one knows what it is, even though it's at least 10 years with a new name. You have to work 20 hours on top of your studies to qualify. And there's also a racial subtext that for upper middle class white students, the most important thing, it's the most important thing, it's the most important thing. When I went to Columbia, I was told, don't do more than 8 hours of work study a week, it'll really hurt your studies. And yet, as a requirement, unless you do 20 on top of your studies, that doesn't count as work. Now, there's a slight caveat to that. If you have a work-study position, then even an hour of work-study triggers your possible eligibility for SNAP. But that's a ridiculous double standard that must be changed.
So when you said that, I think, well, okay, so you're in college, you're struggling to make ends meet, and what do you do?
You work what do you guys do? You work 2 or 3 jobs, on top of your studies. You have no life and your studies falter, and that's one of the main reasons the completion rates in America are so low. All these people huffing and puffing at think tanks, well, what do we need to do to better prepare students? Well, that's all nice, and psychology and counseling's nice, but you know what? You want to help people complete college? 90% of what you got to do is help them afford rent and food while they're studying, right? That would help you more than a counseling session, right?
One of the other groups that we see a lot of students who are struggling for food are international students, because international students typically cannot work off of a campus, so they have to struggle for very limited jobs on campus. And then even if they can work on campus, like Joel said, the rate is so low, the hourly rate is so low that that's not going to really support them. And so many students do come in, international students, saying, yes, they have a sponsor who's going to sponsor them for everything, but they actually don't have that sponsor. And so when we started this pantry, most of the students who started coming were international students.
Could you give us a framework of how much food you're serving at this pantry and the logistics of it?
Sure. So I alluded to this before. We started 2 years ago because we had to get institutional buy-in. So we knew, some of our colleagues, we knew students who needed food, the students who started the center knew it, but then we had to figure out how to make this sustainable. So in the beginning, this was just people buying food and bringing it in for 2 years, and we were giving that out. The numbers were pretty low because we couldn't support a lot of students. At this point, we're at like 40 people because we're open only 2 days at the pantry, so we have student leaders who are volunteering, and then we don't really have specific staff who's paid to run this pantry. So I coordinate the pantry. We have students who we do have running it. I wanted, like Jenique was saying, we wanted not we wanted to have peers running the pantry. So students, in fact, the girl who helps us says, I use the pantry. So it takes some of that stigma away. So whenever she goes around campus and she says we have a pantry, she also says that she uses it. At this point, we are about 40 to 50 bags per week, and we're open 2 days.
And how often can someone come, and how many days worth of food is in each bag?
We give them at least 2 to 3 days of worth of food, and somebody can come once a week. But we're not strict on the rules. Like if they need to come, we do say to them, you can come. In no way do I think that this is a solution. I think that this is a very temporary solution, and at this point, we're really happy that we got sustainable funding. What we are planning to do now is to grow that funding and to expand what we're doing.
And maybe I missed this, but are there any eligibility requirements at all?
No. So international students, adult degree students, those are the main people who come into the
You need just a Lehman ID.
You just need a Lehman ID, that's it.
And how far do your students travel? Don't some of them travel very long distances to get there?
So 60% of our students do live in the Bronx and Manhattan. And so, yeah, the majority of them do live around there, and we do say, so we're open 2 days, but we do say, look, if you come and there's a sign on the door and the store is closed, we're right upstairs. It's in our building. Just come upstairs, we'll do the bag for you. We try our best not to set up too much bureaucracy around it.
I visited Kingsborough Community College about a year ago, and I think the president told me something like 80% of their students came from families with incomes of $20,000 or lower, even lower than the citywide average for CUNY. And if you've been there, it's not near a subway, it's a few buses away, a long commute. So I'm just thinking, again, I'm praising what you're doing, but having to go that distance with food in your backpack, a few days worth of backpack, and I assume that really limits your ability to provide perishable food, as well. Again, it's better than not having it, but a piss poor way to fight hunger in a city where there are about 53 billionaires.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm also curious, I would imagine that 2 days worth of food is actually being stretched to feed more than just one person.
Oh yeah, for sure.
To feed a family.
And you said you're serving about 40 people?
Per week,
yes. And I think there's probably 20,000, about 10,000 Lehman students?
Lehman, yeah, and I think a part of it is that a lot of students don't even know we have the pantry yet. And so what we're trying to do right now is to ask professors to put it in their syllabus, to tell people, but then when we start getting an influx of students, we're concerned that we have enough food. And so none of this is ideal, and we're just working through it as we're expanding.
One last question, so not to grill you like you're on a Senate committee here, but is the administration actively supportive or kind of just letting you do this? Because I know you've gotten a lot of publicity on it. So
we recently got a brand new president who, at the food pantry opening, said to the students, when I was in college, I needed to use a food pantry, and I've benefited from a lot of public service, which was a fantastic endorsement from the president of the university. And he is a big social justice advocate. We are now getting a lot more institutional support.
That's good to hear. So switching vulnerable populations. Another vulnerable population in New York is the elderly and aging populations. They have fixed income and affordability issues, mobility and access concerns, and certainly, as Joel has pointed out, much food insecurity and hunger is based on economic issues. 20% of New York City adults above the age of 65 live in poverty. Many of them have no regular income aside from Social Security, and 1 in 10 lives in a household with insufficient food. Can you please talk about this vulnerable population? What are some of the unique issues other than the ones I mentioned, and some thoughts around that topic?
I think what I've found is one of the biggest issues is mobility. It's the ability to get to food. So even if you have money, if you can't get to it, that's problematic. And so at the food pantry level, for instance, we are trying to encourage more people to do delivery to home services and things of that nature. Meals on Wheels can only cover but so many people. I find that even when you think about, for seniors also, there's again that pride issue. So even for those who can get to the pantry, they don't want to stand on a line. They don't want to be there for 2 hours waiting for food. And so we really have to figure out how can we bring services of any kind to our seniors. What does that look like? As well as recognize that there are generational beliefs and parts of their people's cultures where they may not want to sign up for SNAP. They may, there was a generation of you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that comes from somewhere. So how do we get around the psychology of all of that?
Yeah, and I think probably also the other unique thing about this population, I don't know if it's unique to this population, but certainly, food, we're talking about access to food, but we haven't really talked about access to nutritious, high-quality food. And if you are compromised in some way immunologically or some other kind of disease, then certainly food can be both a form of medicine as well as a basic necessity for energy. So I think that's another thing that is unique to that population among other populations that are experiencing health challenges. And then of course we get into the cost of healthcare and the Affordable Care Act, and all of these things are even under intense threat currently with this current administration, and those are things we need to be paying attention to.
I would also add the one thing is we're also seeing a lot of seniors who now have to take care of other family members. So we are seeing grandparents with raising toddlers, and now their budgets are stretched even further, and there's no support even for that. No one's telling the grandparent about the kinship program where they can get money for those children. No one is giving them the support that they need to help their families that they want to be there for. So now what limited dollars are being stretched among other vulnerable populations as well.
And at least some of that is happening, or a large part of that's happening because our insanity incarceration crisis in America, and the hidden victims of the family members of incarcerated, so the massive numbers of grandchildren being raised by grandparents because their parents are in prison often for ridiculous infractions that if you're a rich white person, you get a week of raking leaves for it. And I just want to say, seniors, there are a few 100,000 senior citizens in New York living in homes that can't afford enough food. And as bad as senior hunger and poverty is, and take off the table the mobility issues for a second, senior citizens before the New Deal were the poorest people in America, and now statistically they're less poor. Why? Because the Social Security Act, Medicaid, and Medicaid. And if those are slashed, as some in Washington are trying to do now, it will get even worse. And so we just have to keep in mind that. And people, there is a bootstrap mentality, but also people have hazy memories. They don't remember how much they've been helped by government a zillion times a year, from riding on public roads to publicly supported subways to public hospitals to public libraries to public parks to public schools to if they're rich real estate magnates, for instance, how the government building inspectors protect their buildings, government firefighters and police officers protect their buildings, their materials are brought in on public roads through public ports. So there's a lot of false narrative about this so-called bootstrap when, and who's getting welfare when the wealthiest in the society are by far getting the most wealth.
Just a question about access with the elderly. There's been I think it's with delivery companies like Amazon Prime and Fresh Direct and Peapod. They're about to, or they already have, or they're about to be able to take SNAP. There was a somewhat failed program that took place with Fresh Directs in the Bronx. What about that in terms of, not to make this whole discussion about healthy access, but specifically for the elderly, about being able to create, affordability of healthy foods, not being able to having to leave your home. What are your thoughts on that?
The food isn't affordable. I mean, I'm not elderly and I'm not in poverty, and I have times where I say, I can go to the supermarket across the street and get the same amount of food I can get from Fresh Direct for half the cost. So if I'm using my limited SNAP dollars, why would I order from any of these places? Those places are not built for people on a budget.
I agree, and the biggest mistake some people make about SNAP shopping at farmers markets and elsewhere, well, people can pay more because it's not real money, it's just SNAP. Well, that is real money for them. That's money they don't have to spend at someplace else. So we are talking to some of these companies, and the pilot in New York City, at least for Amazon, should roll out next spring. And I've been very clear to them that unless you bring down the price point, it's going to fail.
And that may happen, and there may be subsidies that are related to these programs, because I think it's an answer to less infrastructure in relationship to getting food out there.
Although sooner or later, when more companies are allowed to do this, I do believe, for all my socialist-like rhetoric, in the free market to some degree, and I do believe it will eventually bring down prices if more companies have an ability to do this.
Yeah, switching to, not to run quickly through any of these underserved, vulnerable populations, undocumented immigrants have issues. They're not going to be getting SNAP or WIC. Thoughts about that group and what some of the issues that they're facing, obvious, some of them are very obvious, and things that we could do about that.
I think it is. I think it is fairly obvious. It's the fear and anxiety of the ICE raids, and I think that's also increased tremendously, of course, since this new administration. And we've had many calls from folks that that are serving this population, that have been serving this population, food banks and food pantries around the country, that have seen a decrease, a decline in the number of documented and undocumented both immigrants that used to use the food bank and food pantry and aren't coming any longer. There are a couple of organizations that have been doing trainings around this issue for food banks and food pantries around the country, so that so that they know their rights as an institution, and they can help documented and undocumented immigrants understand what their rights are, and they can provide safe entry back into the food banks and the food pantries. But that's of grave concern. And then for instance, over the summer meals program, the summer food sites, the summer program food sites, that those are public places. So there's even more fear there that if you send your child or take your child to a camp where they're getting summer food, that's a public place, a park, a swimming pool, and that the fear of the ICE raids in those public institutions was also tremendously great this summer, and I think had an impact on the children of immigrants getting food.
And what are some of what's the granularity of the training, if anybody knows? What are you telling people to make them feel secure that they can come and get food at a food pantry?
Yeah, I don't know if I can speak to the granularity of it. People might have done that.
I do, and the problem is advocates don't agree because the situation is so murky. So some of our peer groups are telling them it's fine, don't worry about it, and I'm telling them we cannot make that promise. To get a little deep in the weeds on this, there's a thing called public charge that says that if you're sort of using welfare of the state, meaning the federal or state or city government, then under federal law you can be less likely to become a citizen, and therefore more likely to have one or more parts of your family deported. And under the Clinton administration, for which I worked, Bill Clinton clarified that that receiving SNAP and health care from the government does not count as welfare. That does not count as a public charge. And there was a floated executive order that the president, meaning President Trump, it's hard for me to get that out, is basically considering an executive order that would say that getting SNAP food stamps does make you a public charge. And I believe he could probably do that by executive order, and it would good chance it would withstand a court challenge. So the hard reality is that they might be able to punish immigrants for doing this, and I wish I could guarantee that they couldn't, but they might. And so I don't, as horrible as I feel about, having my staff advise people, here's the risks of getting food, people don't want their families torn apart. And people called our office and asked for help getting off the programs, voluntarily giving up thousands of dollars worth of food. Because they're worried about their families being tortured. And let me just say, this means election matters. If anyone of you here didn't vote and you're eligible for vote because you said all sides are the same, or you voted for Jill Stein because someone's not perfect, and you say, oh, she was going to be no different than the other guy, think again. And if you're registered to vote and not voting next Tuesday in the election, shame on you. People around the world are dying. So elections matter, and for all of, impeach one side, etc. You impeach Trump, you get Pence. You impeach Pence, you get Paul Ryan, who's as hostile to poor people. There's no substitute to winning elections with progressive candidates. And let me just say one more thing about immigrants for all those who say if you're not rightfully in, New York by the people who are rightfully here, when I say if you're not Iroquois, get the hell out.
Iroquois Indian.
Iroquois Indian, yes, Native American.
So if you do want to learn more about what those trainings are like, the Immigrant Defense Project and the Center for Constitutional Rights is doing those trainings for public institutions and private nonprofits that are serving undocumented immigrants. So that's a place to look.
Is the city doing anything? New York City? Anybody know?
They're doing as much as they can under federal law, and I must say, on hunger issues in general, my judgment, the de Blasio administration has been great. You may know their head of social services is a person who spent a few decades as a legal services lawyer suing the city, and now he's in charge of the city agency he was suing. Probably on these issues more progressive than me, and a really good manager, and so they're doing everything they can, but there's only so much you can do under federal law. The New York City ID program helps a bit, and other things. And I should say the Women's, Infants, and Children program has no immigration restrictions on it. I don't know if you're taping this or this part, but only 2 states have imposed one, and one is Indiana under then Governor Pence. And so even a program that gives food to pregnant women and children under 5 that has prevented 500,000 babies from dying at birth. A so-called pro-life governor, prevented people from getting that program. And the man who prides himself on his, very religious faith, ignoring the founder of the faith's point of letting we feed everybody. And so those are the very real risks at stake here, and it's sat through a city council hearing on the deportations. It's not professional to sob in public, but I was trying not to.
Not speechless.
Have a great morning.
I see. So switching topics again to another underserved group. A report in 2016 at the UCLA School of Law found that 1 in 4 individuals in the LGBTQ community experienced food insecurity in the last year. What are the unique aspects of their struggle? Are they not signing up for benefits? What's going on in this community that makes food insecurity higher?
I can't speak to the statistics and whether or not they're actually signing up for benefits. But I think that probably what's unique to this population is that even though we have the Marriage Equality Act, we didn't have it for many, many years, and there is a direct correlation between economic security and marriage. Whether, even if your marriage is in divorce, you have protections and rights. And so unmarried couples tend to have individuals in unmarried, in partnerships that are not legal, tend to have a higher level of economic insecurity, which of course can lead to food insecurity. And I think also, particularly for young people, and I know that there was a study, I believe it was in New York City, or at least I remember reading about it in the paper, that the number of homeless LGBTQ youth that the high schools were beginning to notice and take notice of, that I think as a young person, coming out still to your family can have tremendous repercussions. And you can lose what for many of us is a social safety net, is our families. And so I think that is probably a unique aspect of food insecurity for that population.
And then you add on to that as if you are a cis presenting person, do you want to walk into a church where most of our food pantries and soup kitchens are all of those spaces welcoming to you? So you now don't have the family safety net. You talk about marriage equality and how that is very new, so you maybe aren't married, and then on top of that, you don't feel comfortable going to the spaces to get access to free foods. So where do you go? What do you do?
And there's still something like 28 states that don't have employment protection, benefits for same-sex partners as well. So that continues to be a struggle.
And in many states, it's still legal to fire someone for their sexual orientation. So we have a long way to. I just want to add, there are a lot of stereotypes about the LGBTQ community, including that they're all rich, and it's just nothing close to true. And there's certainly a problem with people sort of dispossessed by their families. One irony is the federal government for the food stamp program was marrying gay people long before marriage equality, because if technically under the program, if you're two adults living together, even if you're not related, if you buy food together and share it together and cook it together, you're considered one household. So basically, for a long time, if it helped the federal government shaft low-income people, they considered you married. If it would help you, they wouldn't.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I want to sort of throw out there that I think could make for an interesting discussion is that while we're talking about these different populations, that we need to, I think, remember that social and political circumstances are largely intersectional. There's nobody here who's just a woman. I'm a white woman, I'm a white heterosexual woman, or I'm a senior who happens to be Black and lesbian. Those intersections matter, and I think that they can help us also understand how we need to be organizing across movements, across issues of regardless of identity, and really understanding the complexity of those identities and the complexity of the social, political, and economic circumstances we're in because of those intersections.
Thank you. No, that's important. So I just wanted to talk quickly about the mobile markets. Can you describe what they do, just in case people don't know? And I think they're interesting and impressive and so forth, but one of the things I noticed was the eligibility requirements. And the second thing I noticed was that they're few and far between. So, but they're great. So can you talk about them and explain them?
So before my time in City Harvest, I've been there about 8 years, the city had designated areas of high poverty and high rates of diet-related diseases throughout each borough. And City Harvest decided to adopt one neighborhood in each borough where we would open up special services. One of those services is what we call a mobile market. It is it's a twice a month fresh produce distribution. We currently do 2 in each borough, in Bed-Stuy, Northwest Queens, which is kind of that Astoria, Queensbridge area, South Bronx, the Stapleton, North Shore area of Staten Island, and Washington Heights, Englewood. So most of them, 8 of the 9 that we currently have, because we only have 1 in Brooklyn right now, is run out of NYCHA houses. So that's where some of the eligibility comes from, because we've had, for instance, tenant associations like Dyckman Houses where they are sponsoring our mobile market. They have said we cannot open it to the zip code or open it beyond just their residents. So we are sometimes constrained by the partners that we work with. However, we sign people up by family size and they are given 2 weeks worth of produce at each market.
And as long as they're a member of that, if they're undocumented or whatever it might be, it's fine.
We don't ask any of those questions, and we don't turn anyone away. So, for instance, if someone happens to get on the line who's not from Dyckman Houses, we still give them food, but we don't give it to them maybe by family size and those type of things, and we don't publicize that we do that, so that's between us.
And this is part of that, we broadcast this. Anyway, this is part of the Healthy Neighborhood programs that you have. And is there, and I know that that's kind of a limited program, and I thought it was a 5-year program and so forth, but maybe I'm wrong. But I guess the real question is there thoughts of expanding this program? And I'm sure there are thoughts, but is it in the works, or?
So it was a 5-year program that has now become a program in perpetuity. And it includes things like healthy retail, so going into those neighborhood bodegas and saying put the apples in the front and the cigarettes in the back. But part of the limitation that we face in terms of expanding it is just our own organizational capacity. You know, we are a mid-sized nonprofit that does not necessarily have the type of staffing that it takes to do some of this work. Our mobile market takes, 30 people. So it's because what we really want it to be is we don't want it to be here's a bag of food. We really want to set it up in a dignified manner so that people are coming and it's like a farmer's market.
Yeah, and I think you've done a really good job with that. And it's not even something that is the core function of City Harvest, and you've made it into something really wonderful. So I have 2 questions before I'll open it up to the audience. One is, and these are kind of for Joel. You had mentioned to my class 5 years ago, and it stuck with me, I can't stop thinking about it, about charitable narcissism. And I was wondering if you could talk about that briefly, and then I want to ask you a question about some of the myths and barriers around SNAP and WIC and the sign-up process, which I'd like to open up, and then I'll open it up for questions.
I deal with that in my first book and my new book a lot about this, that charity has morphed in America to sort of representing a symptom of what's wrong with the broader society. But I was in one food bank, I won't mention where, and they had a sign to the staff, our top goal is to make sure the volunteers here are happy. I think our top goal should be to end hunger. And so the very acts, which are supposed to be the most altruistic, have all been about making people feel good. And all the messaging around hunger volunteerism, it's quick, it's easy, you're making a real difference. Like every soup kitchen, food pantry, food bank, food rescue group, cleaning group in America, the dollar value of their food is about 1/20th of the federal safety net, 1/20th of the federal safety net. City Harvest does an amazing job. They're one of the best food rescue groups in the country. The mobile markets are amazing. They're about $120 million, if I read the 990 right. The SNAP program in New York is about $3.7 billion, dollars versus 120 million. So our narcissism is that thinking that everything's easy. Winning World War II wasn't easy. Winning the right to vote for African Americans and women wasn't easy. This isn't going to be easy, but it's our narcissism. We want to think everything should be easy and fun. No. And that's why I'm Mr. Frowny Pants.
Yeah, I think the sort of cult of volunteerism is ubiquitous in most food banks. That from what I've seen around the country, that's it's not just one food bank, but that's where that sign exists. I've walked into food banks around the country where there's not even a break room for the staff, and there certainly isn't a sort of community center for the people they're serving. But there's a whole section, a whole wing of the food bank that is set up for volunteers so that they can relax and enjoy themselves and get to know each other. And there's a real community building, and not that that's not important. I think it is indicative of this this issue of charitable narcissism, and also the idea that, and I think this is really in our mainstream narrative, that charity is going to end hunger, and charity will never end hunger. Never. And one of the things that we've been very involved in over the last 6 years is working on both a narrative change project to really shift that narrative from all you need to do is care about your neighbors and take the cans off your food, out of your own personal food pantry at home, and take it to the local food pantry, and we can help each other that way by ending hunger. to move that needle from charity to really social justice, that it is going to take a global movement, not just a national movement, but let's start with a national movement that is intersectional and that is led by the people that are most impacted. That is what we need to build. And that is where we need to give our time and our energy and our money. It's a both and. People need to eat now, and we want them to get high quality food and in a way that is infused with dignity, as Jenique said. And we also at the same time need to be organizing. And the organizing needs to be among those that are being served by the food banks and the food pantries in order to ultimately hold our government accountable.
If I could just say, because you remind me of food drives, they drive me nuts. The only thing makes less sense than a food drive overall is a food drive in a low-income neighborhood that schools do, not understanding that the people being helped. You know, this equation of poor equals homeless, when homeless is this very small subsection of, they don't understand they're collecting food pantry food and food stamp food from the families so everyone can feel good about themselves. And if you knew your grandmother couldn't afford prescription drugs, you wouldn't suggest a prescription drug drive where everyone in the neighborhood goes into their cabinet and donates the prescription drugs they think grandma needs. It's because we don't trust poor people with anything. Yeah, and so God forbid we give them money and they'd waste it not on food like that lima bean kit we got them, but they'd waste it on something like rent. And one other thing, I love my food bank friends dearly, but understand some of the volunteer activities are basically fraudulent. They have one group move the cans from one side to another, then the next food comes in. You know, they literally hide the forklift in the back when the Cub Scout troop comes in, something that could take their staff 5 minutes to do. They waste 2 hours of a group to do. They have a professional food processor there that will chop up the carrots in 3 minutes, and they have, you know, a group of people doing it, spending 3 hours because they think it'll make people feel better about themselves and donate more. Not to be crass, but that's why they do it.
And one thing that to bring up is, and not to belabor this, is that everybody here and in New York City has all kinds of diverse skills. And I didn't take that, I got this from Joel. And if you're a web designer, you know, some of these food pantries might need web design. Use the skills that you have and that you're best at, and try to provide those as, you know, as charity.
Those are actually more valuable to a food pantry. Because many of them do not have, they're started by very well-meaning people who do not realize that they're running small nonprofits, and they need that assistance. It's why they struggle, it's why they have such difficulty moving to the next level. But I just wanted to say, let's be very clear, most people do not volunteer because they care about other people, they volunteer to make themselves look good. It's why every single year I field hundreds of calls around this time for people who want to volunteer but don't recognize that people are hungry in May, and maybe we can use you then.
That's right. And I think also it's important to, again, it's sort of this dialectic, right? It's a both and. I think we need to distinguish between the more community-based food security, food access efforts and the food banks. I think that the food banks are problematic. The larger, the 200 plus, you know, regional and statewide food banks that we have around the country that are supported by Feeding America, I think are really problematic. And I think they're problematic because they are another form of obfuscation, right? So we have slowly since the 1970s, we have transferred the responsibility for the most vulnerable in our society from the government to private nonprofits. And those food banks, they are masters at distributing food, acquiring and distributing food. The scale of efficiency is mind-blowing. And every year, they measure their success by the number of pounds of food that they've been able to distribute and the number of people that they feed. And the assumption is that needs to go up. And I would challenge that as an ineffective and false measurement of how we're moving the needle in this country around hunger.
So I'll say one nice thing about food banks, having criticized, as you know, there are some more progressive food banks around the country that are fighting for higher wages and support a right to food, that are lobbying very hard for SNAP, and part of our collective job is to reinforce the need for them to do that.
That's right. And I would agree. I think that is an incorrect measurement, and I deal with it day to day. I oversee the mobile markets, and I've had my mobile market director say to me, the numbers are going down. What do we need to do? And I said, that may not be a bad thing. Let's figure out what's going on in this community. Is it that there are people in need who aren't coming, or is there things going on that are positive in this community where we aren't needed? So I do think that we need to have that conversation about, just because things shift, because we give out less pounds, because less people come, that does not mean we are now not successful somehow. Maybe that actually is our success.
I mean, one of the things for us we don't really, it's not a food bank, we partner with the food banks, but for our food pantry, what we started doing was, in the food pantry itself, we have different resources. So if our food pantry wouldn't be enough for the students, we know 60% of them do live in the Bronx. So we have in their handouts telling them all the food pantries in the neighborhood that they can use. We have some resources on campus that can help them with Metro cards or paying their rents, or where the SNAP office is on campus. So just giving them those resources, that's one of the things that we wanted to do it in our pantry. But we don't want to just look at, I don't think looking at numbers is, that's not one of our measures. Oh, we're serving more people in that school. That's not even our goal. It's just to feed our students temporarily until they graduate.
Thank you. So we're going to be able to only take about 2 or 3 questions from the audience. And we have our first question. Just introduce yourself and where you're from.
My name is Peggy. I grew up in West Harlem before it became gentrified, and I live in the Bronx now. One of the things that I want to get a better handle on is that there's a lot of discussion on the help that should be available, or that's available to the underserved. And I know my mom raised us as a single parent. She was working in the garment district, not making much money. But one of the things that she practiced and she taught us to do was there are certain sacrifices you have to make. Rent, food, and a lot of other things had to go by the wayside. And I don't know how much of that is being taught to individuals today in the underserved markets. I just moved back to New York about 2 years ago, so I've been in other parts of the country. So that's my question, is by giving free, I'm not suggesting it's a bad thing, but a lot of folks, as I'm on the subways, on the number 6 line, I see what they're eating, I see what they're feeding their children. The palates have to be changed. You can offer all the fresh food in the world. That's not what the kids are going to want to eat. That's not what the adults are wanting to eat. I see them eating such bad food when the fresh food options are available to them. People need to go beyond. My mom used to take the subway to go shopping to get quality food. I'm hearing in the Bronx, some of the people running for office, well, no one should have to go more than half a mile for fresh food. Not true. Sometimes you have to. Use that shopping cart and go. So there are sacrifices that need to be made, and I'm not hearing that type of training. And it's a decision you have to make. You have $1, how are you going to spend it?
I think I agree with you to a certain extent, but I also think that we have to ask the question, why are the palates changing? Why are people choosing that kind of food? And I think that while there is certainly some agency involved, which is what you're describing, I think we also have to look at where our dollars writ large are going towards marketing bad food to children, towards the subsidies that are provided to agribusinesses and to big food, that they have more presence and their arms reach much further into these communities. And so there is a structural barrier and a need for a certain amount of systems change at the same time that we're doing that education and really supporting that agency in making the right choices.
I actually don't agree with you. I don't agree that the main problem is that people are making irresponsible choices and that low-income people have some ethic of entitlement out of the people. And in my life, I have a very unusual existence. I spend a fair amount of time with rich people trying to get their money and a fair amount of time with low-income people doing my job. And the people who seem entitled to stuff
to me, overwhelmingly are wealthy people, not poor people. The median family income in New York is about $50,000 a year. As you know, even in a low-income neighborhood, it is not uncommon to pay $2,000 or $2,500, a month, $2,000 or $2,500 a month for rent. So if you're making $50,000 for your whole family and have $24,000, in rent and everything else left over for food, MTA cards, which have risen far faster than the minimum wage, etc. Now, that being said, if I say to challenge to some of my more conservative friends that 80% of the problem is economics, and if people are working 2 or 3 jobs and they're just not traveling enough, I don't think people in America with so many billionaires and merely having $1 million doesn't get you on the Forbes 100 list, that the problem is low-income people don't sacrifice enough. But if I challenge conservatives to say much of it, the problem is economics, I also challenge the left not to totally discard personal responsibility, and that personal choices do matter, and that we ought to do more to reward personal choices, responsibility, and so that only people guaranteed food shouldn't be prisoners, and we shouldn't take away people's food benefits if they get another job.
Just to add one thing, I think, and not to move on, but I think also it's this parallel line of providing food, but also providing education, so that people can make, not that they're making a personal choice whether they should either buy a textbook or eat or do something, but that when they are making choices, that they're making the best possible choices from a health perspective. So that when they are with their SNAP dollars or with any benefit or even a food pantry, that just, this whole idea that, oh, the poor can eat unhealthy food, that's okay. Trying to get them the best food possible and also the education to make those choices.
But I think we prove every day when they have the ability to make those choices. Your mobile markets sell out every time, right? Yeah. It's not like people go by, don't take their fruits and vegetables to get the chips. We have a CSA program. We subsidize that, and there's a waiting list on it. If you make food affordable and available, low-income people will make healthier choices. Education's important, from the wealthiest billionaires who are overweight to low-income people, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is they can't afford healthier food, and it doesn't exist in their neighborhoods. And a half-mile walk for someone with a disability or someone with 3 kids in total is a long walk each way.
Good morning. My name is Caitlin Greer. I'm with the Institute for Children, Poverty, and Homelessness here in New York. And my question is for all of you. I'm curious about programs that you've seen that work, a what works question when serving children and families who are both homeless and suffering food insecurity.
It's a broad question.
Higher wages work. We know poor people don't waste it. They spend it on food and rent, and subsidized housing works. And the main reason, sure, there's some mentally ill, substance abuse people who are homeless, but the main cause of homelessness in New York State is rent too damn high.
There's one example, yeah, I agree, and I think there's one example I'd point to in terms of the conversation we're having here today. There is a soup kitchen called Neighbors Together in Brooklyn, in Brownsville, that has incorporated, and they work with adults, they don't work with children, but they have incorporated a program where they are organizing and providing leadership training and advocacy training to folks that they serve that opt in, and said, what are the issues? What are the issues that are most important to you that you want to do advocacy around? And they said housing. And so here's a soup kitchen in Brownsville that has been very engaged in the three-quarter housing issues that exist in Brooklyn, and going with their clients, with their patrons, up to Albany to advocate around those issues. So I think that the more, I guess my point is that the more that the food banks and the food pantries and those that are serving people who are homeless and in poverty or just low income, that the more they can engage them in identifying what those issues are that need to change, and then honoring that and working to help change that. I think that's an excellent model and a way we can really begin to build and shift and really work more at the root causes of why we have hunger.
Thank you. Thanks. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Joel, Alison, Jenique, and Suzette for coming here today. And the intention wasn't to solve these problems, but to give some light on some unique issues. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Also, again, make sure to check out NYC That is our website, our newsletter, and we have 2 to 3 original articles there each week and research and so forth. Make sure to sign up for our weekly news digest, which announces our breakfasts that we have and all of our events. This coming November 30th, we have an all-day food as medicine conference with 20, I think it's about 30 speakers now. I think I'm guessing what is 22 speakers? 32 speakers, okay. 32 speakers, and many of them you'll be familiar with, and it's an all-day session, I think, and it's free, and food is going to be served by Dig In at lunch. So I hope to see you all there. We'll probably sell out with the first day that we have it available because it is free. So please look for it. We're probably going to announce it on Friday. Okay? So thank you very much and have a wonderful day.